Welcome, everyone. Dear friends, welcome to the 20th annual Days of Jasenovac's conference. My name is Barry Lituchy. I'm Executive Director of Jasenovac's Research Institute. This is the 20th year that we've held a conference to coincide with the day of commemoration for Jasenovac, which is April 22nd. So we started holding annual conferences around the International Jasenovac Day. I'm letting people in. It's a little confusing. We started holding annual conferences in 2003. We missed 1 year. We had to suspend our conference in 2020 due to COVID, and we weren't prepared for an online conference at that time. But we did have a very successful online conference last year. Oh, I should just press it all. We had a very successful online conference last year on Zoom with Michael Berenbaum and the director Gaga Antonijevic who produced the film and who worked together on the film Dara. This year's conference is Jasenovac in the context of other genocides in the 20th century. And so we're very honored to have with us as our guest speakers Professor Gideon Greif from Tel Aviv in Israel, and Dr. Aleksandar Stojanovic from the Institute for Recent History of Serbia in Belgrade, Serbia. And I will introduce them after a few more comments that I'm going to make today. First of all, I want to just inform you that 9 days ago, we commemorated the 77th anniversary of the heroic breakout of the prisoners of Jasenovac. And as we normally do, we laid a wreath at the Jasenovac monument, which JRI established in the Holocaust Park in Brooklyn in 2005. And we also laid flowers at the monument for the victims of Jadovno, which we established several years ago as well. And as you may know, Jasenovac was the largest concentration camp and death camp in former Yugoslavia during World War II, run by the Ustasha. And hundreds of thousands of victims were murdered there, but it constituted a triple genocide because hundreds of thousands of Serbs, 100,000 Romas, and at least 25,000 Jews were murdered there. So it constituted a triple genocide. And why do we commemorate International Jasenovac Day on April 22nd? We do so because, and it's also the reason for the establishment of the Jasenovac Research Institute, we established it because the history of the Holocaust, the memory of the victims and survivors and the heroic breakout of at Jasenovac was being whitewashed. It was being covered up. It was being forgotten by Holocaust organizations all over the world during the 1990s. And this was not a coincidence that this was happening at that time. It was, in fact, a coordinated effort to downplay the crimes of the Croatian fascists and other collaborators with the Nazis during World War II, such as the Bosnian Muslim fascists and the Albanian fascists in former Yugoslavia. Now, I should say that among the heroic prisoners who broke out on April 22nd and thereby ended the Holocaust in Yugoslavia, there were thousands of Croatian anti-fascists, Slovenian anti-fascists, even Bosnian Muslim anti-fascists who were imprisoned in Jasenovac during 1941 to 1945. And we don't want to forget about those. But on the final 2 days of Jasenovac, the first, on April 21st, the female prisoners were all murdered. The remaining 1,000 or so, or a few hundred that still were alive. And the men knew that on April 22nd, they too would be murdered. And so in the face of machine gun fire, rifle fire, and other types of weaponry, the prisoners decided to break out, the 1,000 that were still alive on April 22nd. Most of them died in the process of breaking out. Perhaps 100 survived the breakout. And they did so, in other words, they ran through machine gun fire, and they did so with the express purpose that at least 1 or 2 of them would survive and tell the world what happened at Jasenovac and the crimes committed by the Ustasha, as well as the German Nazis and other collaborators. And so we owe it to them to remember them, and to keep that memory alive, and to remind the world what happened at Jasenovac. And our slogan of Jasenovac Research Institute is simply, let the truth be known. And we find today that there is an increasing kind of amnesia about the Holocaust. There is increasing amount of whitewashing of the crimes of the Nazi criminals during the Holocaust. We see some parallels taking place today with what went on in the 1990s, whereby Ukrainian crimes of genocide are also being whitewashed, and contemporary reemergence of fascism and pro-fascist ideas and tendencies are being overlooked and apologized for. So our work today is to consider this whole problem, and also to think forward. What are our tasks ahead of us? I want to move first to a minute of silence in commemoration not only of the victims of Jasenovac, but of all the victims of the Holocaust. 4 days ago also was Yom HaShoah, and also we should remember the partisans and the anti-fascists who fought. 8 days from now is the Victory Day over fascism, and today is May Day, which is also a day in which we can commemorate and think about social justice in our efforts to further those goals. So without further ado, let's have a minute of silence in memory of the victims. Thank you. So today we will begin with a presentation from Professor Gideon Greif, who will be speaking today on the topic Two Hells on Earth, Auschwitz and Jasenovac, a Comparative View. And following Gideon's presentation, we will have a brief question and answer period, not the entire question and answer or discussion period, but a brief question and answer period, followed by Dr. Stojanovic's presentation. And what is happening? Something. Are you with me? Are we having a technical difficulty here? No, I hope not. Are you with me?
Yes, you're fine.
Okay, I was worried because something popped up on the screen that worried me. Okay, very good. So after Gideon's presentation, we'll have a brief question and answer period. Unfortunately, Gideon has to leave at a certain point to give another presentation elsewhere. But after that, we will have Dr. Stojanovic's presentation on the genocide against Serbs and the Serbian Orthodox Church. And then we will have my presentation on Ukrainian fascism over the last century. And we will have then open the floor to a full discussion for everyone to participate in. Just to remind you, you will have the opportunity to use your hand raising symbol, which is in the reaction box at the bottom of your screen. So allow me to just introduce Gideon. Gideon is the author of We Wept Without Tears, a book about Auschwitz, about the Jews who were forced to serve as Sonderkommandos in the Auschwitz extermination camp. And he's also the author, among other works, of Jasenovac's The Auschwitz of the Balkans. So he is a very distinguished professor and lecturer on the Holocaust, has worked with Yad Vashem in the past. We're very honored and delighted to not only have him speak here today, but also to consider him as a very good friend of Jasenovac's Research Institute. And so without further ado, Gideon Greif, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I'm very honored to be here with you today. I'm very thankful to you, Barry Lituchy, for inviting me to this conference. In today's lecture, I will concentrate on a comparison between both camps, Jasenovac and Auschwitz. Both camps, Auschwitz and Jasenovac, although belonging to different geographical spaces, are synonyms and symbols of the extreme cruel regimes they represent. Auschwitz has become synonym for the whole Holocaust and crimes of Nazi Germany, and Jasenovac has become synonym for the unprecedented Ustasha empire of cruelty of independent state of Croatia. Both places, Auschwitz and Jasenovac, embody the non-human principles of the two regimes and their murderer attitude towards anyone they considered an enemy, an undesirable or inferior person, or those who did not enthusiastically support the regime. A thorough comparison between the Auschwitz chain of camps and the Jasenovac chain of camps reveal many identical aspects relative to the development of the camps, the technique of killing, and the attitude of perpetrators towards the prisoners. Naturally, there were also significant differences between Jasenovac and Auschwitz due to the origin and mentality of the criminals and to their psychologies. Through generations, human society developed a code of moral values in order to protect its cultural achievements and ameliorate the moral codes of civilization. This system of moral codes was completely destroyed and annihilated in Auschwitz as well as in Jasenovac. 3,000 years of civilization were destroyed at once, and replaced by a destructive, murderous, anti-human set of values. Darkness obscured humanity, and millions of people had to live under the brutal rule of terror. That is exactly what Yechiel Dinur meant when he called Auschwitz another planet. Auschwitz, the biggest Nazi concentration and extermination death camp, and Jasenovac, the biggest complex of Croatian Ustasha concentration and death camps, were both sites which deserve the title Hell on Earth. In the following minutes, we are going to compare the two hells. Both the Nazi and Ustasha regimes were motivated by racial theory, which dictated their policy and their behavior. Nazi racial theory was central in all spheres of German public life from January 30, 1933 on. When the new regime came to power, the whole nation was obsessively considering the question of blood purity and racial purity. The results of the investigation into racial origins were crucial for the career and even life for each individual. German medical doctors and geneticists collaborated with the regime and helped to decide who was to be taken to the special program for so-called euthanasia, the murder of the so-called life unworthy to live. Anti-Jewish legislation was based on racial principles and led to mass discrimination and hatred directed towards the Jews in Germany and later in any country under German occupation. The Ustasha regime was greatly influenced by German racial theory and fully adopted it. From the first day of existence of the Ustasha independent state of Croatia, the government implemented racial laws against the Jews, Serbs, and Roma, using the exact methods of discrimination which were already in place in Germany. The racial laws had a strong effect on the daily life of Jews, Serbs, and Roma, who lost their position in laws, lost their civil rights and their property. Finally, the laws enabled the authorities to deport them into concentration camps. All these racial laws paved the way for the policy of annihilation. Auschwitz is known as the biggest factory of death among the camps which Nazi Germany established in order to implement the so-called final solution of the Jewish question. Its size was 40 square kilometers. However, at the beginning of its existence, Auschwitz was not an extermination camp. The original intention of the Nazi authorities was to build it as a prison for the local Polish population suspected to be hostile and dangerous to the German army or found guilty of acts of resistance. The turning of Auschwitz into a factory of death was a result of previous experience based on the methods of the German mass killing implemented during the Barbarossa operation. This operation started on June 22, 1941. In the framework of the Barbarossa operation, about 1,600,000 Jews were murdered by the so-called Einsatzgruppen, mostly by shooting, partially in gas vents. This system of mass murder was problematic for the perpetrators for several reasons. It was too slow, it was too expensive, and psychologically problematic for the murderers who had to look directly into the eyes of their victims. During the few months of such mass killings, as conducted in Babi Yar, for instance, the German commanders responsible for the final solution decided to change the method completely and instead of shooting, introduced permanent killing centers where no guns were to be used but poisonous gas. The new system solved all the problems that I've just mentioned. It was cheaper, it was quicker, and the killers didn't have to look into the eyes of their victims. The only contact with the murdered victims were the screams which emerged from the gas chamber and which could be heard around the area. The mass killing process in Auschwitz was completely impersonal. As we shall see later in Jasenovac, the system was different. It was personal, it was direct, it was manual, a close, intimate, passionate murder. On the basis of the criminal and pathologically distorted ideology of the Nazis and the Ustasha, the similarities between the two camps are easy to distinguish. The Ustasha regime was to a very great extent influenced by Nazi Germany and its ideology, and wanted by all means to demonstrate this close relationship to Nazism. The best example of this is the fact that the final solution of the Jewish question in Yugoslavia was introduced by the Ustasha even before it was introduced by the Germans. When the Ustasha started implementing anti-Jewish measures in April 1941, the final solution was not even decided by the German Nazi authorities. The killing process in Auschwitz was more sterile and cleaner, with some distance between the murderers and their victims, whereas the killing process in Jasenovac was more direct, and the murderers enjoyed looking at their victims being murdered and tortured and did not need any physical distance during the execution of their crimes. This point demonstrates that the Ustasha killers acted according to more barbaric lines of behavior than the Germans, a fact which even Germans report about Jasenovac. In this sense, the report of the General Gleise von Hostenau, German military envoy to Zagreb, is worthy of note. For the German officers, the method of Ustasha killing were too wild and too barbaric in comparison to the system enacted in the factories of death like Auschwitz, Birkenau, Chelmno, Belzec, Treblinka, Majdanek, Sobibor, Mali-Tosten, etc. Despite their demonic crimes, the Germans still wanted to be considered cultured. Photos which exist show us the amusement and fun of the Ustasha murderers while performing their crimes and monstrous competitions who will kill more overnight. They didn't have psychological problems while doing their cruel deeds, nor did they feel any twinge of conscience. This difference allows us to state that the killing process in Jasenovac was much more barbaric, much more brutal, and much more primitive. The sophistication needed by the Germans to protect their soul was not needed by the Ustasha killers. In order to implement the new killing system in Auschwitz, a new mass murder process was developed based on the use of poisonous gas. At the beginning of 1942, two sites of mass murder were prepared in Birkenau, a sub-camp of the main camp Auschwitz called Stammlager, to which the killing activity was transferred from the main camp. The murder was conducted in two buildings, the so-called Red House or Bunker Number 1, and the so-called White House or Bunker Number 2. The first transports of Jews who were deported to their death by the RSHR, Reichssicherheitshauptamt, reached the new killing facilities in Birkenau in February 1942. Due to the process of further modernization, the two bunkers were temporarily abandoned and 4 new modern buildings emerged in spring 1942, gas chambers and crematoria 2 to 5. This steady tendency of modernization of the industrial mass killing is strongly different from the mass killing in Jasenovac, where the process of killing can be defined as very primitive from the beginning until the very end. That doesn't imply that the primitivity had any impact on the number of victims, but shows the primitive way of thinking of the Croat Ustasha criminals, who were satisfied with their own bestial ways of killing and did not look for ways to modernize, pleased as they were with the existing methods. The German method resembled a typical industrial process, namely, the purpose was to obtain the greatest results, in this case, the murder of the highest number of innocent people for the less cost. Nevertheless, the teams in these camps, the Nazi Germans and the Ustasha Croats as well, had a very important common denominator. They were trained not to show the slightest sense of mercy, sympathy, or empathy towards their victims. On the contrary, they enjoyed their brutal and aggressive behavior and looked for new methods of torture, a way to prolong the prisoner's death, and competed who could inflict the most extreme torture, humiliation, and death. The Ustasha, however, were very happy to dirty their hands, and the bloodier their hands, the happier they were. Inside the German killing facilities, the principle of remaining clean, sauber zu bleiben, was introduced by using Jewish slaves in a variety of activities which allowed the German murderers to keep their hands clean. Hundreds of Jews were recruited to the special squad, which you, Barry, have just mentioned, the Sonderkommando, the special squad, which were forced to conduct the most humiliating work in the process of killing, although, and this has to be 1,000 times emphasized, the killing itself was always, without exception, conducted exclusively by the German SS. The slaves had to carry the bodies of the murdered Jews to the crematoria, to remove their valuables, gold teeth, and cut the women's hair, to throw the bodies into the crematoria ovens, and finally, to throw the ashes into the surrounding rivers. In this way, the perpetrators had only to give the orders and not execute the work with their own hands. The impersonal method in killing in Auschwitz was principally based on the famous speech held by the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, in which he emphasized the following, I'm quoting, "We will never get our hands dirty. We will remain clean." The necessity of remaining clean dictated the patterns of behavior of the German team of the camps. In Jasenovac, such an idea of cleanliness did not exist at all. The regulations in Auschwitz were clear and permanent. There was a significant difference between those who were to send immediately to their death after being selected on the ramp by a medical doctor, and those who could temporarily remain alive and become slaves. Those who were sentenced to death, 75 to 90% of the newly arrived, usually did not live for more than 4 hours after their arrival. The others, 5 to 15%, were selected to become slaves. For those who became prisoners, the biggest challenge was to survive under the inhuman conditions which prevailed in the camp. It was especially important to maintain the desire to live. This desire was essential for the continuation of the will to live. Jasenovac survivors support the same psychological principles. As long as they did not lose their desire or passion to live, they had a chance of survival. In Jasenovac, however, the life of the prisoners was more chaotic. There was not the same amount of constant and clear rules a prisoner could adapt to in order to improve his chances of survival. Both camps underwent a long process of dynamic development. As I already mentioned, Auschwitz did not start as an extermination camp. In 1940, its first goal was to be a concentration camp for the local Polish population, a large prison for Poles suspected of being hostile to the German occupying forces or suspected to be part of the Polish underground movement. Only in late 1941, after the decision on the so-called final solution, did Auschwitz become an extermination camp where the final solution of the Jewish question was to be implemented. From June 1941, it also was a concentration camp or a large prison for Soviet prisoners of war who were captured during the Barbarossa operation, which I have mentioned. The fact that until late 1941, Auschwitz was not yet a factory of death does not mean that prisoners were not treated brutally and bestially or that they were not murdered. This is not the case. Many prisoners died or were murdered from the first day of the existence of Auschwitz because of the harsh conditions, the cruelty of the guards, and the fundamental policy of maltreatment, dehumanization, and starvation. Jasenovac was a place of death from the first day, and the mass killing there did not require any official decision like the decision of the final solution. Nevertheless, even Jasenovac underwent some changes which were caused by the war developments or by political changes in the region, and it was dependent on the successes and defeats of Nazi Germany. The killing methods in Jasenovac developed over time and became more extreme and more brutal, based on the same principles of non-humanity and non-mercy in the attempts to cause to the prisoners the utmost suffering. Another difference refers to the policy of secrecy. The Germans tried to hide the reality from their victims by distributing lies and fake information of what awaits their victims, disguising the killing sites as shower or public bath. The murderers of Jasenovac were more direct and thought they had nothing to hide, committing their crimes under open skies. A very clear point of similarity is the greed of both the Germans and the Ustascha. The victims murdered or imprisoned had to hand over all their property which they brought to the camp, and the perpetrators were now the new owners of their property. Possessions such as apartments, bank accounts, jewelry, valuables were already confiscated before arrival in the camp. The Germans were no doubt the greatest murderers in history, but also the greatest thieves. The Ustascha acted under similar lines and started the confiscation of property of Jews and Serbs by April 1941. The Ustascha authorities, under the leadership of Poglavnik Ante Pavelic, tried to imitate Germany and became even more extreme. The pupil wanted to become more extreme than the teacher. Another point of similarity is the fact that the camps were a state inside a state. No ministry, no court, no politician could intervene in the reality of the regulations of the camps. The SS and the Ustascha saw the camps as their own kingdom and felt they could do anything without being criticized, inspected, or punished. They felt they could continue with their barbaric crimes forever. Indeed, Auschwitz and Jasenovac were among the longest-lasting concentration and extermination camps, remaining in operation almost until the end of the war, until January 1945 and April 1945, respectively. Until the last moment, the camp staff were sure they could go uninterruptedly forever, not realizing that the war was going to come to an end very soon. For Nazi Germany, the final solution and the existence of Auschwitz were more important in 1943 and 1944 than any other national interest, even becoming the most important national interest. In light of imminent defeat in the war, the annihilation of the Jewish people was considered the most important goal. The Ustascha came to the same conclusion and considered the continuation of Jasenovac as the most important interest of the so-called independent state of Croatia. Another point of similarity is that in both camps, Auschwitz and Jasenovac, there was a total loss of sanctity of life. The life of the victims had no value, whereas death was worshipped. Yes, death was worshipped. In both places, death was developed into an art and into an ideology. It seems that the members of the SS and the Ustascha competed among themselves who would become more cruel, more barbaric, and more sadistic. The policy of a non-human attitude prevailed in both places, robbing the prisoners of the minimal human dignity, minimal living conditions, minimal sanitary conditions, trying to ruin their inner spirit and their psyche, exploiting their bodily strengths, and finally killing them in various methods. By poisonous gas, burning alive, cutting bodies into pieces, starvation, beating, hanging, etc., etc. In both camps, an inversion of values existed. In Auschwitz, as well as in Jasenovac, a different scale of values was adopted which stand opposite to the normal values of the world before World War II. In other words, the 10 commandments were reversed. For instance, thou shalt not kill was reversed into thou shalt kill. There is a famous sentence written by Jewish poet Paul Celan that says, death is a master from Germany. Der Tod ist ein Meister aus Deutschland. The same can be said about the Ustascha. Death is a master from Croatia. Despite the sense of security that there would be no punishment for the crimes, both camps had severe measures of security to prevent the outside world from getting information of what is going on in the camps. Accordingly, every effort was made to not allow the prisoners to escape. Any attempt to escape was considered the worst crime. In comparison to Auschwitz, some of the camps attached to Jasenovac were dedicated to only female or child prisoners. Auschwitz subcamps did not have such places, and women and men stayed together, although always separated. Both camps tried to exploit the physical power or energy of the prisoners for their own benefit by establishing factories or workshops, as the possibility of replacing the laborers with new slaves was so easy. However, the similar policy of not supplying enough food or adequate working conditions caused the quick death of slave workers in both places, and the industry of semi-industry in both camps was not productive due to the inhuman treatment of the prisoners. Both camps deprived the prisoners of the most natural needs of human beings. Among other aspects, it is important to emphasize the lack of proper medical treatment. Prisoners who became sick or exhausted could not get help and died in pain, getting no medications or almost no medications. In Auschwitz, the so-called hospital, Revier, had nothing in common with the normal clinics or hospitals, providing no real treatment or real medications. A similar situation existed in Jasenovac. Sick prisoners, knowing that the so-called hospital would not cure or heal them, preferred not to complain and continued their slave work, hoping to be cured naturally. In both places, Auschwitz and Jasenovac, it was clear to the prisoners that to complain about their health would just bring them closer to their death. In both places, the medical staff was involved in the most cruel activities. Comparing Auschwitz and Jasenovac, the first might be considered to belong to the 20th century, while Jasenovac reminds us more of the Inquisition of the 16th century, which used primitive methods of torture and killing. Unfortunately, those primitive methods were not less effective than the German so-called modern ones. The modern or the so-called modern character of Auschwitz and the primitive character of Jasenovac can also be seen in the case of the administration. Auschwitz had a very modern administrative system. It had several departments, secretaries, translators, typing machines, a technical team, etc., etc. All this was linked to the German government. There was, of course, a big gap in the normal correspondence between offices, but we should not forget that this correspondence tried to hide the huge crime. On the other hand, Jasenovac did not have any of this. It had no offices, no regular correspondence, no intelligent Jewish secretaries. It was a primitive reality with no necessity of official administration. In comparison to Auschwitz, Jasenovac did not produce any secret diaries or reports. The most important Auschwitz documents are called the Auschwitz Scrolls, which describe the miserable lives of the Jews belonging to the special squad, the Sonderkommando. In both places, ladies and gentlemen, prisoners never gave up their hope to be liberated and made attempts to escape. In Auschwitz, relatively speaking, it was easier, and hundreds of prisoners tried every year to escape, Jews and non-Jews. Most of them didn't succeed, like in the case of Jasenovac, where they tried even though it was more complicated and risky, and only towards the end did the prisoners have some success in breaking out of the camp. The constant attempts of escape show us that the spirit of prisoners was not destroyed. Another significant difference is that in Auschwitz there was an underground movement, quite well organized, whereas in Jasenovac there were no conditions for the creation of such a movement. The similarity between the two camp systems is primarily the result of the fact that National Socialism was similar to Ustashism. Both are extreme, destructive ideologies which planned and executed murderous plans which brought about the annihilation of millions of innocent people. By understanding that Ustashism is no different to Nazism, we might better understand the criminal acts of the so-called independent state of Croatia. Extremely significant is the fact that the Ustasha introduced the final solution even before the Germans did it, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. The persecution of Jews, their deportation to the Jasenovac camps, the confiscation of their property, and all anti-Jewish steps were introduced earlier than in Germany, where the final solution started somewhere at the end of 1941. In brackets, we do not have any document, so we don't know the exact day until today. Maybe one day it will be found. Jasenovac became the slaughterhouse of the Yugoslav Jews, even though at that time Auschwitz was not yet a concentration camp. The conclusion arises that the Ustasha were quicker than the Germans in the final solution, or alternatively, that the crimes of the Ustasha were the final solution before the final solution. The speed of the policy of persecution by the Croatian government was much faster than the speed of the German government. The Croatian pupil, as I mentioned, was quicker than his German teacher. Auschwitz and Jasenovac symbolize the extreme policy of dehumanization of the body as well as the spirit, and the means of reaching those goals were mainly terror and humiliation. The sanctity of human beings did not exist. The only human beings were the murderers themselves, who got the best possible conditions and food and enjoyed the property of their victims. The dehumanization was conducted towards all prisoners in both camps, mainly to Serbs, Jews, and Roma, and all others who were considered dangerous or undesirable or inferior. In certain cases, when prisoners were ready to collaborate, they got better conditions, but with no guarantee that this would continue forever. Both camps had only two kinds of people, the group which had everything and the group which had nothing. In both camps, the attitude of unnecessary suffering was used in order to amuse those causing the suffering. Murdering or killing a prisoner without causing suffering was not enough for the perpetrators. Unless the prisoner was tortured and humiliated, his death was not enough. Unnecessary torture is a term developed by the American sociologist Daniel Goldhagen in his book, Hitler's Willing Executioners in 1996. For this purpose, a variety of methods were introduced to prolong the process of death, causing the victims horrible suffering on the one hand, and amusement for the murderers on the other hand. In Auschwitz and Jasenovac, all repressed, brutal, and evil emotions could be expressed without any fear of the consequences. Within the framework of terror, the camp authorities in both places, Auschwitz and Jasenovac, tried to implement an extreme policy of punishment for real and imaginary crimes. For any form of disobedience, the prisoners were punished severely, and very often the punishment was death and only death. A point of similarity of two camps is that after the war, there were attempts to diminish the number of victims and to characterize the camps as only slave labor camps and not as death camps. This tendency in the context of Auschwitz is called Holocaust denial, but we might use the same term concerning Jasenovac. There is a denial of Jasenovac and the Ustasha crimes by the young generations, and both, unfortunately, continue to this today. Morally, this phenomenon can be seen as a second murder of the victims. The denial murders the victims for the second time, while ignoring their existence, desecrates their human dignity, and is a murder of their memory. Mr. Lituchy, how much time do I still have? I can't hear you.
Myself?
Actually,
we're about 1 minute over at this time. So if you
let
could
me
wrap up.
quickly summarize.
Yes.
Quickly summarize. I have prepared a very short summary. Just a second. Here it is. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, the various examples which were mentioned in this historical introduction leads us to the conclusion that among criminal regimes, there is the worst, but sometimes even worse than the worst. Nazi Germany brought criminality against humanity, which the world hadn't seen to that point. Analyzing all the above-mentioned manifestations of evil, it is not difficult to come to the conclusion that the Ustasha regime and its atrocities were even worse than German Nazi atrocities. The Ustascha wicked minds overshadowed in many aspects the murderous minds of the Nazis. The technique of murder of the Ustascha were much more brutal, wilder, and more malicious. The Croats even surpassed the Germans in their wickedness and in their bloodlust. It seems that they lost all humanity. It is therefore justified to define the Jasenovac as the Auschwitz of the Balkans. We have emphasized the common denominators, the differences, and the identical aspects, and although it is not always possible to compare the two regimes, in this case, it is legitimate and even recommended. In order to send a warning to the world, Auschwitz and Jasenovac should never be repeated again. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gideon. That's a fascinating presentation, and I hope it gets published at some point. So we already have a list of about 4 people who would like to raise a question for Gideon. We're not going to take too many questions because we want to move on with the program. But the first on our list is Mr. Conforti. Welcome, Mr. Conforti. You can unmute yourself at this time.
Yes, I'm unmuted, and I just wanted to, thank very much to Dr. Greif for his extraordinary work on the subject and his efforts against whitewashing as of the question that we are discussing today. I also try not to actually submerge my emotions, but I just wanted to say one thing, that I am, my Jewish family is from Bosnia, and this is very important a day for me to participate and hear Mr. Gideon Greif, because in the Jasenovac camp, my closest family was killed, decimated. That was my grandfather and my grandmother, Yakov and Luna, and 4 brothers of my father, Moshe, Yehuda, Abraham, Yosef, and 2 sisters of my father. First is Rahela, and her 2 children also were killed by Ustasche, Esperanza and Brazzo, and the younger sister, Clara, was killed in Auschwitz. So that's why this is extraordinary, this work of this institution and Professor Greif is doing is extremely important for my family. And then I will, from me personally, and for all the world, the whole world, they have to know exactly what happened. I just want to know that I just want to mention that one of my father's brothers, his name was Abraham Conforti. I hope that I don't know, but I hope that he was one of those prisoners that on 22nd of April tried to break out from the Jasenovac, but he was killed then. The reason why I suspect this is because the business of my family was in glove manufacturing, and he was working. That's what I know from all those books that I read about Jasenovac, and I read everything I could. Is that he was in the group that was called Kožara. That means the leather factory. I mean, quote marks in Jasenovac, and probably he survived until the very last day. But then they, from the Kožara, from that leather factory, there are lots of them that tried to escape, and most of them were killed. So also the 22nd of April is a very important day for my family. Also, so that's why I want to thank again it's Mr. Professor Greif. And one last thing is that maybe, I'm sorry if I missed something, but I wanted to ask Professor Greif, maybe he missed to say that one of the distinguishing features of Jasenovac was that in 1942, there were a big appraisal of the Serb population against Ustaša regime in what is called today Republika Srpska. That's a Serbian part of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And a lot of people, I mean civilians, were captured by Ustaša, and especially kids. So, and then they were all sent to Jasenovac and some other camps that were part of Stara Gradiška, and and I think that's one the feature that doesn't exist for other that camps, is that there were lots of kids there, and they were all
the fact that there was a adoption for children.
Yeah, they were gay for the adoption, and there was a nice movie about it. It's called about Diana. Who saved them. But I just wanted to ask Mr. Gideon, did he, I mean, I hope he knew about it, and if he can tell us something
I mentioned the fact that there was a special camp for children, or even more, and this is unique because because Nazi Germany did not have such camps, just or only exclusively for children. And thank you for your very emotional remarks. Let all the Jewish victims you have mentioned be remembered forever. Thank you so much.
Yes, and thank you too, Mr. Conforti. We're going to move on with the discussion, but I'll ask people to try to limit their questions and comments to 2 minutes or less, if that's possible. And I'll first call upon Professor Norman Markowitz. I think he was next online. I hope I haven't overlooked anyone. But Norman, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I just did.
Okay.
I just did.
Oh, and by the way, you can turn off your hand so I don't confuse you. If
I'll do that.
Also,
right
Mr.
now.
Conforti also.
Okay. Okay. This was a very powerful, very powerful presentation, and I hope first we take the recordings and disseminate them widely. That is very important. I sent to everyone, and then one quick comment. I sent to everyone an article that I had written 12 years ago, Murderers Among Us, dealing with Artukovic, the war criminal who successfully fled to the US and was not repatriated until the 1980s, the Minister of Justice in the Ustasha regime, another prominent war criminal, Sokolev, of Ukrainian background, who was also brought into the United States by American Cold Warriors as part of their war against the Soviet Union and global communism, and an associate of Adolf Eichmann from Bolshevik, all of whom were able to survive in the United States for many, many years. It's important for us, particularly today, to look at the way in which the United States, Britain for that matter, and other countries provided protection for war criminals and those who had been perpetrators of genocide. And that's important for what we are doing. My last comment very quickly to Dr. Greif. Our group began in the struggle against the US-NATO war against Yugoslavia and Serbia in the late 1990s. What do you see, Dr. Greif? What comparisons would you make with what NATO did in attempting their propaganda campaign to portray the people of Serbia as the architects of genocide, ethnic cleansing, etc., with what is now going on in Ukraine, particularly the role
I'm
of
really,
the
really,
US
really
NATO bloc.
sorry. I'm really sorry. I'm not going to do this comparison because it's not my field of expertise, and I have a very good habit
Okay.
not to speak about events for which I'm not an expert, and I'm not an
Okay.
expert to the what happened in the 90s. I'm really sorry. I can speak about World War II before, but not. So forgive me. I can't do this.
Okay.
You're
Okay.
asking me to do next time.
But I'll speak to it later,
Okay.
when I give my presentation,
Okay.
because that is a question that we have to ask. I'm actually most concerned with the, well, you've raised this, Norman, the disappearance or the whitewashing of the crimes of fascists during World War II presently, including by some Jewish organizations here in New York. I've even seen this happen well, I saw it happen in the 90s, and now I'm seeing it again present day with Ukrainian fascists. But anyway, we'll save that discussion for later. Who is next online? I believe it's Linda. I thought I saw someone else's hand up, but since I don't, I will ask Linda to go ahead.
Okay, I have a question. If there is any evidence that the Ustasha guards were chosen for their sadism, because you said the Germans couldn't stand having to look their victims in the eyes. They wanted it to be depersonalized. They want to keep their hands clean. Why is it the Ustasha were so hungry for the sadism and enjoyed it? So was there something in the way they were conditioned and trained, or were they selected for that?
Yeah, absolutely no. Also in the case of the Germans, you have to look at it in a different way. Such cruel places or sites attract people who basically have criminal tendencies or sadistic tendencies. They were not selected for being cruel or sadistic or people without mercy. Not in this case and not in the other, 100%. No, no. They were attracted to it. Not to mention the fact that you could become very rich even working. You know, the common salary in the German camps was, I cannot translate it into a currency of nowadays. It was a really brilliant salary, which nobody of us would resist. And the same with the Ustasha. So no, there were no psychological tests, etc., etc. But the power of evil is so great that it attracts people like this. And I would like to add that not all of them were so cruel. Of course, there were some were less, but you know, the environment had a pressure on them. It's a process which is known in societies. You adapt yourself, even if you alone are not the same pattern, but you don't want to be different from your colleagues or comrades. So I wouldn't say that 100% were so cruel. I would say 80%. And for the prisoner, it was enough to suffer and suffer and suffer and suffer.
Gideon, I'll ask you a question, just sort of jumping off of Linda's question. How were the guards at Auschwitz selected? Because as I understand it, there were Ukrainian guards as well. Is that correct?
No, in Auschwitz, there were no Ukrainians.
No Ukrainian guards at Auschwitz.
No, this is a common mistake. So allow me to correct.
Okay, go
in
ahead.
Auschwitz, there were only two types of guards, Germans and the so-called Volksdeutsche, which are Germans who lived outside in outside countries for generations. They spoke German. And the problem is that those Volksdeutsche wanted to show the other staff, the other team members of team, that they are even more German than German. So they were even more cruel to show how loyal they are, how loyal to the Führer, etc., etc. In other camps like Treblinka, Sobib, or Majdanek, there were Ukrainians, Latvians, and what people did you mention? Yes, Ukrainians.
Perhaps Belarusians,
Belarusians, etc. As eastern the camp was, there were more, the participation of the local population was bigger. Not in Auschwitz. It was different. In Auschwitz, you do not find Ukrainians or people like this.
Oh, it's very important to know that. Thank you, Gideon.
That doesn't say that the cruelty was not big. It was.
Are there any further questions before we move on to our next speaker? Okay, well then, very good. So we can now move on to our next speaker.
Allow me just to thank you for your attention. It was a big
Gideon,
honor.
do you need to leave now at this time?
I have to leave in 2 minutes, and if you will still be online when I finish the other lecture, I will join you.
Please do so. Please do so. Thank you, Gideon. Thank you so much. We'll
Good luck
be in
for
touch.
this important conference. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll be in touch. Thank you very much, Gideon. Dr. Aleksandar Stojanovic, as I mentioned earlier, is a member of the faculty at the Institute for the Recent History of Serbia in Belgrade, Serbia. And today he will be presenting on the genocide against Serbs and the Serbian Orthodox Church in the independent state of Croatia from 1941 to 45. We're very pleased and honored to have you with us today, Dr. Stojanovic. By the way, may I ask you first, how much time will your presentation run approximately?
Approximately less than 20 minutes.
Oh, very good.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Please, you have the floor, Dr. Stojanovic. Go ahead. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon or good evening in Serbia. It's already 8 p.m. It is my great pleasure to participate in this conference. I'm, of course, following the work of Jasenovac Research Institute for some time. I will share my presentation. It's a brief PowerPoint presentation that will allow you to have some facts before your eyes while I'm talking and actually give you a better context. But I'm receiving information that the host has disabled participant screen share. Can we do something about it?
Say that again.
I have the host disabled participant screen sharing. You need to allow participants to share screen.
Let me see. Linda, how do I do that? Let me see. Is it make?
Barry?
Yes.
Barry, what you need to do is you need to go to participants. You need to then open that up and allow screen share for everybody. That's what you do.
Participants, I see. Okay, I see that. Manage
Screen share.
participants.
Sorry, go to screen share, and then I'm sorry, because I'm a participant, I don't have the same icons that you have. One of the icons on the bottom will show you to allow everyone to screen share.
Okay, so it's maybe not participants, is it? Is it participants?
I can't, because I look at a different icon.
Invite, no, that's not going to be it. I'm sorry, that's not the, let's
Open
see.
it up.
How about, I did open up participants and I went to invite, but it only gave me the option to invite, but that's
okay,
not.
what about screen share? What do you have the option to, do you have the icon for screen share?
Unfortunately, I don't see that option.
Can you read your icons?
Barry, go back to participants.
Yes.
And then look for Professor Stoyanovic's name.
Okay, but I don't, okay, manage participants.
I see it, actually. It's at the bottom. Is it Tamara Stojanovic?
Aleksandar Stojanovic.
Tamara is my wife. She's watching.
Aleksandar Stojanovic.
Yeah, but it's listed. Okay, so let's look for Aleksandar. Do you see Aleksandar?
Where would I see that?
He's on the right side on
the right
in a list
side.
of participants. Yes.
Okay, so then
List
let
on
me.
the participants.
Oh, okay, I see.
Then go to more, where it says more.
Oh, okay. Hold on. Let me find Aleksandar.
On the right side.
I don't see him though. That's the problem.
Oh, I'm surprised.
Is he listed under his wife's name?
No,
I could also make you a host. I could do that.
Yeah, you can make me. You can make me a co-host, and then I will have the privilege.
That's much easier for me to do that. Let me just stop video chat, pin, make host. Okay. Yes, I'm going to make you host now, Aleksandar.
Co-host. Co-host.
Well, I can't do that.
Co-host.
It only says change host. It doesn't say co-host.
I'm worried that that might actually affect the recording process.
Yeah, you're
I don't know
right.
if someone has that experience.
Yeah, you're right. It would close down the recording. That's
Barry, can you go through what are your icons? Because I always allow my students to
which
to
icon?
share screen. The ones in the bottom. Can you read them to me? Because mine are different now
Security,
that I opened this one.
participants.
Okay, go to security. Go to security.
Aha.
Open up security.
Okay. Lock
What does it
meeting,
say?
enable waiting room, hide profile, share screen.
Share screen. There you go. There you go.
Aha.
Share it with everybody, and then
Okay.
only Aleksandar will use it. Not everyone will jump in. Don't worry.
Very good. Very good. I think I just did it, Aleksandar.
All right, let's
so.
try. Let's try. Oh yeah, great. Just a moment.
Okay, thank you, Lily. Thank you so much.
I will open the PowerPoint and then share it with everyone. Just a moment. So, do you see it now?
Yes, yes.
All right, let me just play it, of course. All right, so the reason why I chose this topic, there are actually several reasons. First, I was introduced to NDH related or genocide in the NDH related research exactly by the research I did on suffering of the Serbian Orthodox Church during the 1941-1945 period, and also by tracking back the destiny of refugees that came to occupied Serbia during the Second World War. And recently, I was able to actually give some original contribution in research of so-called Croatian Orthodox Church, which was one of the actions Ustaša regime took in order to convert Orthodox Serbs into Catholics and actually convert them into Croats, erase their identity and erase the trail, civilizational trail of their existence in the territory of Croatia. I will have a fairly brief presentation as we agreed. The focus will be on the suffering of the Serbian Orthodox Church, and thus will provide also a context, a general context to the genocide over Serbian people committed in the NDH. If we are analyzing the scope, the scale, and the horrific nature of the genocide that happened in the independent state of Croatia or NDH, one must conclude actually that if we are talking about the institution or organization that have suffered the most, the one is actually Serbian Orthodox Church, or abbreviated the SPC. We will later come to the certain numbers that will clearly corroborate what I just said. But the fact is that no other institution, no other organization suffer that much. And I will immediately go to the main point, and this is try to provide a contextual answer to the question why the genocide over Serbian or on Serbian people in the NDH, and why the Serbian Orthodox Church was targeted so strongly and significantly. Professor Greif did an excellent presentation. Even in the discussion later, we touch upon the possible motivation, psychological, ideological, for war crimes and the people who committed that awful actions, that atrocities, the awful crimes. And in the, I would say, Ustaša ideology, there is a strong historical background of extreme Croatian nationalism or chauvinism, going deep into the past until the 18th century, but especially being developed in the 19th century, the second half of the 19th century, by Dr. Ante Starčević. He advocated a policy that only a Croat nation or Croatian people has the right to be considered a political nation in the Croatian territory. All others are either to leave or to be assimilated into Croatians. That political agenda, that political theory is also named the Croatian state theory, or the state right, or Croatian historical right, and is derived from Starčević's ideas developed in the second half of 19th century. Ante Pavelić and Ustaša just made his ideology more radical, and they just actually put it to life in the certain historical circumstances, like for the Nazi attack on the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, and then the occupation of country and the establishment of the NDH. Before you have the set of anti-Serb decrees and laws introduced in the first month of the NDH. This is how actually the path to the full-scale genocide was paved. These are the main ones that are actually focused on the Serbian Orthodox Church. And especially I would like to bring your attention to the law decree on conversion from one religion to another, introduced on May 3rd, 1941, which actually is a set of regulations and set of procedures one has to pass or follow in order to convert from a certain religion, mostly from Orthodox Christianity, to another religion, in 99% the Catholic Christianity, although theoretically also conversion to Islam was possible. At the moment when this decree was introduced, no one could actually foresee how important it will become in the following months, and how huge, how whole-scaled will be this massive campaign for Serbs to abandon their Orthodox religion and convert to Catholicism, actually stop being Serbs and convert to being Croats. And this is something which is one of the, I would say, cornerstones of Ustaša ideology and I would say national and racial policies during the NDH's existence. Another decree is from the July of the same year, when the use of name Serbian Orthodox faith was forbidden, and the Serbs were to be referred as to Greek Easterners. So it was forbidden in the NDH to use Cyrillic alphabet as a Serbian national alphabet, to even use a Serbian national name. Serbian Church was to be subjected to a huge scale plunder, huge scale destruction, and the faithful people who were members of the church were to go and actually went through the most horrific periods of their lives. The suffering of SPC on the territory of NDH is so huge that it is hardly comparable to any other institutional suffering in the Second World War. If we look just the numbers are witnessing it by themselves. Over 400 Orthodox churches and monasteries were demolished, burned, or heavily damaged during the 1941-1945 period. I would also add that around 800 churches and other religious objects belonging to the Serbian Orthodox Church were damaged, and numerous, many of them were desecrated, vandalized, all kind of rape, violence, murders happened at the church altars. Over 700 church bells have been taken down from the churches and melted and used for war industry or other purposes. And for the local communities, when they are building or erecting the church bell is a symbol of unity. The church bell is usually the greatest individual expense the community has to make, actually, to buy the church bell and to make the church operating. And when you have destruction of the church bells, this is a strong message that the community and the church are no longer welcome there. The violence against the clergy of Serbian Orthodox Church was also immense. Estimates vary a lot from the range of 100 to over 500 priests and monks that were murdered. Briefly, I will touch upon why these estimates vary. Some authors would calculate in only the active priests serving on the NDH territory at the eve of the Second World War. Others would calculate in the retired members of clergy, retired priests, the theology students, other monks and other members of clergy. But by name, we have determined more than 170 priests and monks that were murdered in the NDH. Among them are 3 named bishops of the Serbian Church, so high-ranking bishops, and beside them, Zagreb Metropolitan Dosite Vasic, who was tortured, molested, almost beaten to death, and then after one intervention by the German officials in Croatia, he was deported to Serbia, where he died in January 1945, never fully recovered from the horrors he survived during the 1941 Ustaša violence in Zagreb. As I would say, good case study on this violence and the destruction, Gornjokarlovačka eparchia or Gornji Karlovac eparchy can actually be used. It is one of the largest, or actually one of the largest eparchies on the NDH territory, and the one with the greatest suffering and greatest destruction. Out of 220 churches existing in the territory, 188 were destroyed, and out of some 157 priests, 65 were killed. The bishop, Sava Trlajic, was also murdered. Other members of clergy were mostly expelled or deported to Serbia. And you have here the photos of some of the destroyed religious objects. Many of them were never reconstructed. From left to right, we have destroyed churches in village of Visuća, erected in 1733, in Sadilovac, erected in 1826, in Služnica, erected in 1749, in Mutilić, erected the same year, and in the bottom left, we have the church in Veljun, erected in 1824. Above the photo of the destroyed Veljun church is an icon of Sava Trlajic, who was declared to be a saint, martyr saint of Serbian Orthodox Church in 2008, and he was brutally murdered in Ustaša violence. The violence over clergy, the violence over the faithful Serbs who didn't want to abandon their faiths was so huge and so primitive, with a number of such disturbing details I would rather not disclose with you in this event, but are very well recorded in historical sources and historical literature, of course. And just to mention, there are very, very valuable works written on the suffering of the SPC in the NDH by Viktor Novak, of course, by Vasilije Krestic, by late Jovan Mirković, Veljko Đurić Mišina, and late academician Dinko Davidov. Dinko Davidov actually maybe gave the best description by titling or naming his book Total Genocide. It's a very informative, highly illustrated book, bilingual book in Serbian and English language. I would always highly recommend for introducing one into the violence in the NDH. Because it was not just a genocide focused on murder of the people. It wasn't just Jasenovac, Jadovno, Gospić, Pag, murders of hundreds of thousands of civilians. It was the set of actions done systematically by the Ustasha regime in order to erase the very trail of Serbian existence in the NDH territory, of their cultural identity, their historical identity, like they never existed. The churches were destroyed, graveyards and cemeteries were desecrated, tombstones were destroyed or removed. Some areas were completely cleansed from the Serbian population that used to live in that areas for centuries. And that's why it also encompassed the destruction of holy relics of Serbian saints from medieval era and later periods, destruction of sacred books, birth, baptism, death, and marriage records. So every possible trail that the Serbs existed in certain areas under Ustasha regime were forcibly erased. To showcase systematic terror on the SPC and Orthodox civilians, I would also like to use the case study of the old, so-called old Orthodox church in Osijek. You can see it while it was still standing in the left photography. It was erected in the mid-18th century. This building was torn down piece by piece, as you can see in the central photography, and then it was actually declined to a pile of bricks, as you can see on the right photography. And this was all done by the Office for the Demolition of Orthodox Churches, which operated from 1941 until the April of 1942. This probably unique institution in the Second World War Europe was actually established to efficiently destroy and demolition churches, Serbian churches, Orthodox churches, and actually arrange the sellout of construction raw materials, bricks and others that were actually then offered to private proprietors, buyers, for bargain prices. And that's how the Ustasha regime would involve even wider range of Croatian public into the crimes that were committed. Many SPC objects were observed by the Catholic Church. They were converted to Catholic churches or to the other objects of Catholic Church, or were actually confiscated by the Croatian authorities, so-called Ministry for Renewal, Ministarstvo za ponovu, for reconstruction. The intense campaign for conversions to Catholicism was led ever since the late spring of 1941 until more or less the end of the existence of the NDH. These conversions are called in Croatian historiography religious transfers. But we are talking about dozens of hundreds of Serbs who either voluntarily or forcibly converted to Catholicism in order to save their lives, save their families, save their property. Until today, we were not able to establish the exact number of such conversions. And what is even worse, we do not know how many of the people who converted during the Second World War actually never reverted or never returned to the religion of their ancestors. And after the terror over Serbian civilians and church, and conversions or conversion policies failed and were actually met by a huge scale uprising of Serbs in the summer and autumn of 1941 and 1942, then a new tactic was developed and developed by with the assistance of German Nazi Germany Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and this is to leave Orthodox population as Orthodox, but they are not allowed to be members of Serbian Orthodox Church. Instead, the Croatian Orthodox Church was established in April of 1942, and many churches that belong to the Serbian Church were converted to Croatian churches. And interestingly enough, the clergy of Croatian Orthodox Church were Russians and Ukrainians, the refugees who fled to Yugoslavia after revolution in Tsarist Russia, or later in the Soviet Union. And to slowly round up my presentation, here we have a number of photos showcasing the conversions. In the top part of the slide, you have several such actions. The central photography in the top shows Dr. Sidonie Schulz, one of the members of Catholic clergy who strongly advocated the conversions, who actually initiated many of them themselves, and he is converting Serbs of Bosanska Dubica in 1941 to Catholicism. The photo on the right is more sinister. It shows Serbs gathered in Orthodox Church in Glina, in Banija, in summer of 1941. They voluntarily gathered there to be converted and to be spared, but instead they were slaughtered. And Glina Church massacre was one of the most notorious war crimes and atrocities committed in the NDH. The role of Catholic clergy in the suffering of Serbian Orthodox Church and Serbian civilians in the ADH is quite significant. Until this very day, this is considered somewhat controversial, but we have on the bottom left corner Archbishop Alojzije Stepinac actually meeting Poglavnik Ante Pavelić. Stepinac, although he haven't participated in any direct crime himself, provided a strong moral support to Ustasha regime and Ustasha policies in the first year of NDH's existence. Some people who served below him, who were members of clergy and some bishops of Catholic clergy in the NDH, participated in the horrific events even more directly. However, Stepinac is a good case study. In a central photography, you have him standing in front of the court in communist Yugoslavia. Somehow, he actually managed to get out of this entire story as a martyr. He is perceived not as a villain and a criminal, and not as someone who provided moral support to one of the most horrific regimes in the history of civilization, but as a victim of communist dictatorship and terror. Because he was imprisoned, he was sentenced and imprisoned, or actually sent to some kind of mild internment by the Yugoslav Communist Court. And on the bottom right is a figure of Krunoslav Draganovic, who is actually the true face of Catholic clergy in Croatia. This man is responsible for organization of red lines or red channels, and actually organizing the escape of hundreds of Ustasha criminals, but also other Nazi collaborators from territory of Yugoslavia and elsewhere to the countries of eventually to the countries of South America mostly. He was the one who helped Pavelić escape and many others. During the existence of the NDH, he was among the most notable members of Catholic clergy. He was a professor of University of Faculty of Theology in Zagreb. He was in various commissions and organizations made by Croatian state and Croatian on Catholic Church in Croatia during the NDH existence. Supposedly, he was also an intelligence agent of several countries later, including the West Germany and United States of America. And finally, one thing that actually has to be mentioned is how this suffering of Serbian church and Serbian people in the NDH is remembered now, how it has been whitewashed and forgotten and erased. In the left part of the slide, we have a postcard from 1903. It says, "Greetings from Glina." As you can see, the Orthodox Church is actually dominating the outskirts of this small but beautiful town. In the central photography, you see a pile of rubble, of actually what remained of that church after the Ustasha violence and destruction. And it stayed like that for a number of years after the Second World War. Later, the communist authorities erected a memorial place on that spot, which was heavily damaged during the 1990s war. And nowadays, as you can see on the photo of the right, it is a Croatian home in Glina. So something that promotes Croatian culture, Croatian national identity, and has nothing to do with commemorating the innocent civilian victims that were slaughtered in a most brutal way in this exact place. Thank you for your attention. It was my pleasure to participate in this event.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aleksandar Stojanovic, for that excellent presentation. That raised so many interesting parallels and very interesting points. We'll take questions and comments now, but I just want to say, before I do take a couple, I just want to point out that the burning of the Serbian Orthodox parishioners at Glina also reminds us of the burning of Jews in synagogues, you know. And so there's, Aleksandar, you can unmute yourself. It's okay, because you'll have to answer questions anyway. And also the other parallel that was so striking in your presentation that I wanted to mention is the fact that wherever fascists or people or governments that support fascism reemerge in the post-World War II period, we see also that they turn monuments or museums that were dedicated to anti-fascism into monuments that promote fascism. This has happened all across the Ukraine as well in recent years. And I think I had one other comment about that, but oh yes, that religious persecution, as you pointed out, sometimes precedes and predates genocide or the rise of fascism and the use of genocide as a policy by centuries. And we see that all across, we see that in Ukraine as well, that religious persecution predated and sort of set the foundation for later genocide. Well, thank you very much, Aleksandar. The first person on the list again is Mr. Conforti. Go ahead.
Yes, yes. I just wanted to say, I mean, again, something from connected to my first-hand witnessing in the previous session. that I have obligation to say now that something about Stepinac. This is that, okay, I told you about four brothers of my father that were killed in Jasenovac, and they were collected in Zagreb in early in 1941. But together with them, there was also a fifth brother, which is called Yehuda, Yeshua Conforti, Salvatore Conforti. He was also put in the prison there, and he had to be transported with the other brothers to the Jasenovac. But the problem, he had a wife who was also Jewish, but her best friend was a girl who was married to some very high, I don't know exactly the name or who it was, ranking Ustash clerk or so. The point is that he managed, because Stepinac said, okay, as he managed to convince Ante Pavelic, the head of state of NDH, that it's good to release from that prison, which was in the Zagreb Fair Center, to release 10 Jews from there. And then the wife of my uncle, Salvatore, managed to, through the connection to her school friend who was married to Stasha Clerk, managed to put my uncle to that list. So he managed to escape, and his wife, therefore, the Jasenovac, and they escaped to Italy, and they, of course, survived the Second World War, as well as my father and other parts of my family who also found the refuge in Italy, because Mussolini didn't kill Jews. It just, they put them in certain areas and didn't let them go from those areas, but they would be, I mean, it was like a paradise compared to what was in Croatia and in all those places occupied by Germans. So that's what I have to say about Stepinac. I mean, he was under the process of Catholic, in the Catholic Church. He is like one step close to be proclaimed as a saint, because he was martyr of the communist regime in Yugoslavia, in communist Yugoslavia. However, Pope Francis stopped that talking. He organized talks between him and the Serbian Orthodox Church and the Croatian Orthodox Church, and he managed to put this on hold. All I want to say in the end is that definitely, I mean, I have to witness that he actually did help some Jews, as he did help some Serbs, and he was not maybe the follower completely of the Nazi ideas, but he actually, I think, poisoned his soul, as the Croats will say, because of his love to Croatia, to country and the nation. But definitely, he doesn't deserve to be a saint, and hopefully, it will stay, and the process will stay at a state where it is right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Conforti. Before I call on our next speaker, who is Professor Norman Markowitz, I'm just going to say about the whole situation about Stepinac. First of all, the United States foreign policy was to save Stepinac, and in 1948, as a result of the split between Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia did make a deal with the United States and the State Department to save Stepinac from the death penalty. So, in fact, this was the real reason why Stepinac was not punished to the extent he should have been. And unfortunately, there was a campaign. It launched in the United States and elsewhere in Western Europe, which turned him into what the French would call a cause célèbre. He was like the great cause, to say, anti-communist cause, persecuted by communism, but in fact, he was a war criminal and he should have been punished. And unfortunately, he has been rehabilitated, and he should not be. We should try to pursue a campaign to de-rehabilitate him and put him in his proper place as a someone complicit in genocide. Okay, Norman, go ahead.
Okay, very quickly, you just said a lot of what I was going to say, Barry. Let me say, I remember in my youth, a high school in White Plains, New York. It's still there, Archbishop Stepanak, and the glorification of him as an anti-communist symbol, and all of the lies that were part of Cold War propaganda, and nothing but that. To Aleksandar Stojanovic, just in passing very quickly, one of my late colleagues who I had huge affection and respect for, whom Barry also met, Traian Stojanovic.
Oh, yes.
If you're any relative to him or know of him, that would be interesting.
Yeah.
And two other brief points. I remember from my reading, a prominent Serbian woman who was given the choice of converting to the Catholic Church. I forget her name, it's somewhere in my materials, who refused and who died, who was murdered at Jasenovac. And I forget her name, and if anyone is worthy of, in the Orthodox tradition, some kind of sainthood, it would be her. And one last point, just for the record, some may disagree, but the most advanced, the most humane, the most positive, and the most civilized government that existed in the Balkans was socialist Yugoslavia, whose achievements, with its flaws, with its negative qualities, but whose positive qualities were in terms of the living standards of the people, their social cooperation with one another, and the overall achievements of Yugoslavia and its role in the world were unprecedented. Those who destroyed Yugoslavia have helped, along with those who destroyed the Soviet Union, et cetera, have helped to create the world which we now live in and struggle to change.
Yes.
Thank you, Norman. Alexander, would you like to comment?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I would like to briefly answer or actually share my remarks. Thank you all for your comments, your insights. Of course, Stepinac is a controversial personality. I am fully aware that he intervened for a certain number of Serbs and Jews and others. This is well documented. But he has a supreme moral authority, unprecedented, in the Croatian state. And he did publicly nothing or next to nothing to condemn Ustaša regime, to condemn the great suffering, the mass violence that was happening. He was fully aware of it. He was receiving letters even from honest Croatian civilians who were informing the high-ranking Catholic clergy about the atrocities that were happening to their Serbian neighbors. Even some honest Catholic priests who were, of course, disapproving of that violence and the forced conversions shared their worries, and there was almost no reaction whatsoever. On the other side, if you look at the newspapers from the NDH, you will see Stepinac shaking hands with Pavelic, standing next to Artukovic and other prominent war criminals, and this is all that should be considered. Of course, unfortunately, the court process in front of the court in Yugoslavia had many flaws itself, really. he wasn't accused for the things he could actually be accused, and he would be, of course, convicted in any normal country and in a normal court of law. And there was a huge scale international lobbying process in the, I would say, Cold War aesthetics or Cold War climate to actually spare him and to actually relativize his responsibility. And unfortunately that worked. And nowadays, for generations of Croats, he's a hero, he's a martyr, and they think that the information on his participation or he's looking the other way while innocent civilians were slaughtered are just some kind of Chechen propaganda, which is unfortunately not true. And of course, we had remarks regarding the socialist Yugoslavia. I have to say I'm no expert on socialist era, but I can say from the perspective, comparative perspective of the eras I researched, the pre-war and war era, or interwar and war era, and then the present times I'm living in, I would say that we are generally in the Balkans having huge problems with state building process, with development of institutions. And in many eras, the ordinary people were the one who suffered the most, who struggled, who had economical difficulties. The corruption was always really high level. And I would have to agree with Mr. Markovic that actually during the socialism, for an ordinary working man or women to say, the living standard and the life was much more meaningful than it is today or in the previous eras. It's something that actually, when you look into the comparative perspective, it's what actually comes to one as only possible conclusion. Having in mind, of course, that it was a dictatorship, that freedom of speech was limited. There was only one political party, and everything else, the huge loans and huge international financial aid due to Cold War context and everything. But yet, with all things considered, it was probably the most successful state we had here.
That was a fascinating presentation, and your comments are also extremely interesting, Aleksandar. I don't see any other hands being raised at the present time, so I think we can proceed to my presentation. As you know, today's conference topic or theme is Jasenovac in the context of other genocides in the 20th century. My presentation today will actually not so much focus on the genocides committed in the Ukraine, but rather the long existence of a fascist movement, and so the evolution of that fascist movement over the past 100 years in the Ukraine. So there will be some parallels that I'll draw between some of the with the prior presentations, and I will begin now by saying, first of all, that I do not think that extremist nationalism adequately explains or describes the nationalism of Ukrainian fascism, or of the Ukrainian nationalism that has existed, that has gripped the Ukraine at least since 2004. If we define fascism as a nationalist ideology that includes racism, anti-Semitism, militarism, territorial expansionism, anti-democratic paramilitary organizations, the defense and use of genocide as a policy, and imperialism, Ukrainian nationalism checks all of those boxes, both past and present. This is not to suggest that nationalism itself is fascist or necessarily fascist, or that it should even be condemned. In fact, the expression of national culture and identity is a democratic right that we uphold, and even most countries support. However, when nationalism becomes the tool of empires and is encouraged to adopt racist and militaristic and genocidal aims, as was the case with German nationalism, Croatian nationalism, and Ukrainian nationalism, then it turns qualitatively into something quite different, which is fascism. There is no doubt that there are also some shades of gray between right-wing nationalism and fascism. How did and when did Ukrainian national identity emerge? There are three answers to this question. The first is that it emerged over time in the westernmost provinces of the Ukraine, namely Galicia and Volhynia. These two provinces were first absorbed into Lithuania and then into the Kingdom of Poland in 1444. While they were under Catholic Polish rule, the enserfed peasantry, which would have identified with the Russian Orthodox Church at that time, were encouraged or persecuted, really, and encouraged to separate themselves from the Russian Orthodox Church and become members of what became known as the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, or Uniate Church. So we see also a parallel with what happened in Yugoslavia in the Balkans as well, because many Serbs were encouraged to join a Greek Catholic Uniate Church there as well. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was established in 1596. Prior to this time, the Slavic peasantry had identified as Russian, and in earlier centuries, there was a state known as Kievan Rus, and the Slavic people from from Galicia and Volhynia all the way east across present-day Ukraine and into Russia and to the Volga River, all identified with the Russian Orthodox Church. They had one church, one language, one territory, and one state. And indeed, they were one Russian people, actually, until this first step in the creation of Ukrainian nationalism took place in Galicia and Volhynia. Secondly, there was also the absorption of Galicia, Volhynia, and Bukovina by the Austro-German Empire, the Austrian Empire, in 1772, when Poland was first partitioned. And in fact, these territories would remain under German imperialist rule, or Austro-German imperialist rule, Catholic Austro-German imperialist rule, until 1918, and then would not be returned or reunited with Russia until well, first with the Soviet Union in 1939, and then again after 1945. A third way in which the Ukrainian national identity emerged was, of course, through the oppression of the Slavic peasantry in Galicia and Volhynia by Polish and German aristocrats, landowners, and of course, under serfdom, that oppression was quite severe. Although serfdom was abolished in 1848 after the revolution of that year, after that point, the Austro-German rulers turned toward a different kind of religious persecution against the Slavic peasantry. They began to pressure the Slavic peasantry to join the Greek Catholic Church in larger numbers, and they sent in Jesuits to help convert the peasantry. Thousands of Jesuits served in this capacity throughout the 19th century, and even crossed the border into the Russian Empire, because this was a part of the long-term plan of the Austrian Empire and later the German Empire, this to project their authority into Russian lands as part of their Drang nach Osten, or drive to the east policy, as for German expansionism and Lebensraum. And so we see that religious persecution preceded and was the first tool in, especially of the Orthodox populations, in the tool of German imperialist expansion. And in this way, the Ukrainian national identity was being forged. And this developed through the 1800s, and then we see an expression of Ukrainian identity. And of course, that at first was not a threat to anyone at first. Now, Ukrainian nationalists and historians will all agree that the Ukrainian national identity and nationalism became fully mature only around the time of World War I. And it was at that time that they did indeed find also some extremists among the Ukrainian nationalists who would lead it in the direction of fascism after World War I. The most significant person in terms of being the father and founder of later Ukrainian of Ukrainian fascism was Semyon Petlura. Semyon Petlura was born in 1879 in central Ukraine, in Poltava. He had, like some other very much in common with German policy, had tried to infiltrate a Russian Orthodox seminary and convert people, and was found out and kicked out in 1898. He later became a journalist and wrote for an extremist or ultra-nationalist newspaper called Slova prior to World War I. On the very day after the February Revolution in 1917, which was March 8th, according to our calendar today, 1917, on March 9th, Ukraine declared independence, its independence as a country for the first time. That summer, Petlura joined the Ukrainian Rada, the central government or general secretariat of that government, and became the head of the military for the independent state of Ukraine. And it was at that time that he, well, actually, from the time he entered into the government, he advocated, among other things, Ukraine for Ukrainians, Ukrainian being the only language, the only legal language in Ukraine, all other languages being banned, and also the the claim that non-Ukrainians had to be eliminated from the Ukraine. So that meant nearly half of the population of the Ukraine would have to be eliminated: Poles, Russians, and Jews, as well as other ethnic minorities. Now, interrupting Petlura's activities, which would include over 1,000, actually over 1,200 pogroms during the time he was in power throughout the Ukraine, from 1917 to 1921. Interrupting that was the German and Austrian occupation of the Ukraine from late February 1918 until late October 1918. During that time, the Germans had seemed to be on the verge of accomplishing their dream of taking over the Ukraine and annexing it to their empires. 400,000 German troops from the Kaiserreich and 250,000 troops from the Austrian Empire occupied the Ukraine during these months, which were sandwiched between the Brest-Litovsk Treaty and the surrender of the German empires in November 1918. During that time, the German authorities did not actually had a separate put into power a man, Skoropadsky, who was not as racist apparently as the other, as say Petlura, and Skoropadsky was more complicit or more compliant with German imperialist aims than Petlura, who was determined to create an independent Ukrainian state. And this is why Skoropadsky is not as beloved today among Ukrainian nationalists as Petlura. However, as soon as the Germans left in November of by November of 1918, Simeon Petlura not only came back into power as the main person, he actually became the leader of the government from that point on until the final defeat of the Ukrainian Rada. And this is when he really began to carry out his genocide against, particularly against the Jews, but he was against the Russians and the Poles as well. One of the towns that Petlura pogromed was my paternal grandfather's town, Zhashkov, which is today called Zhashkiv. And I was fortunate enough to have two of my relatives sit me down and explain the entire story of what happened during the pogrom in Zhashkov in August of 1919. And it is very similar to what happened during the Holocaust. In the case, except for the fact that some Jews were allowed to escape and survive the pogrom if they could pay for their lives in gold, because the Ukrainians said, these Ukrainian pogromists said that the Jews are only good for their gold and their money and nothing else. And so Jews who did not have gold or money were to be put to death. And that's precisely what happened. The Jews were of Zhashkov, today Zhashkiv in central Ukraine. There's also a Zhashkiv in Galicia, but that's a different town. The Jews of Zhashkiv were, who did not have money, were brought to the synagogue or to other buildings and were burned alive in those buildings. The remainder of the people who did not have money were either shot or in some cases simply stabbed and butchered with sharp objects. So that was Petlura and his government. Petlura fortunately was overthrown by the Soviets, by the Red Army, and he had signed a deal with Poland. And this is important for the history of the fascist movement, the Ukrainian fascist movement. Poland, the Pilsudski government at that time signed an agreement with Petlura, in which Petlura had agreed if the Ukraine was defended by Poland, Ukraine would give Galicia and Volhynia to Poland. When, of course, Ukraine was lost, Poland simply reabsorbed Volhynia and Galicia, and Petlura and his followers were left with nothing. Petlura, well, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers were then interned in Poland from the end of the Russian Civil War until 1928. Petlura, however, was allowed to flee to Paris, where in 1926 he was assassinated by a Ukrainian Jew whose family had been murdered by Petlura. By the way, Petlura was in fact present at the time of the pogrom in my grandfather's town of Zhashkov. He oversaw that personally, and that was not uncommon for Petlura to do. He considered himself a military genius as well. In any event, the internment camps for the Ukrainian troops became the center of the organizing activities of Ukrainian fascism in the late 20s. So already by 1927, 1928, the organization of Ukrainian nationalism was established out of these camps. In particular, two men who had served under Petlura and who were from Galicia, and in fact, who were in fact also Austrian either officers or soldiers in the Austrian Imperial Army during World War I. One was Andrei Melnik and the other was Yevhen Konovalets. Together, they established the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, or OUN. And of course, they had very close connections with Petlura. They considered Petlura as their leader, but now deceased, now assassinated. And they would remember Petlura when they did invade the Soviet Union in 1941 in carrying out further crimes of genocide in the Soviet Union. There was already a new generation of younger members coming into the organization of Ukrainian nationalists in the late 20s and early 30s. Among them was Stepan Bandera, who was about a decade younger than Melnik and Konovalets, and who ended up being arrested in Poland through his OUN activities. By 1936, Nazi Germany was bankrolling the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. So we see again, another parallel with Croatian fascism, Ukrainian fascism being taken under the wing of, being established in the late 20s, being influenced by Italian fascism, but ultimately being brought under the wing of German Nazi fascism by 1936 in the case of the OUN. By 1939, the Nazi Reich had trained some 20,000 OUN fascists for military service. And this was the beginning of the military wing, one of the military wings, or the most important of the military wings of Ukrainian fascism, which was called the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the UPA. This army was highly trained by the SS and by the Wehrmacht. They were highly motivated as well because Galicia and Volhynia and the rest of the Ukraine, well, at least those two provinces, had been ceded back to the Soviet Union as a result of the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement. And so they were quite prepared to fight a war of genocide against the Soviet Union by 1939, even though Operation Barbarossa had not yet been launched. By the time of Operation Barbarossa, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army itself had over 200,000 men. So this is a very significant army, and it would continue to recruit. It would continue to have it was never actually defeated during the time of 1941 to 45, because it continued to fight all the way with some success up to 1950, and with diminishing success until 1952 on the western borders of the Ukraine inside the Soviet Union. Remarkably, they fought both the Polish Communist government and the Soviet government after 1945. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army had this trident insignia, which today is the insignia of much of the Ukrainian military to this day. Trident by itself is not fascistic. It's simply the perpetuation and continuation of World War II genocidal armies that is troubling about the trident. Of course, you also have the symbol that was used by the other Ukrainian military force, because the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, even though it was the main force that invaded the Soviet Union in Ukrainian army that invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, there were also other groups like the Nachtigall and the Roland battalions that were directly under Wehrmacht control. And they also had different symbols, which are, again, in use today by the Ukrainian military, such as the, what is it called? The wolf's hook, I believe it's called, or the wolf's angle. The other very important Ukrainian military organization that was created by the Nazis was the Hilfspolizei. The Hilfspolizei numbered about 5,000. Their role during Operation Barbarossa was solely to assist the SS Einsatz group in genocide. So while the Ukrainian Insurgent Army and the other Ukrainian fascist military forces were carrying out a war against the Soviet Union, but also committing crimes of genocide, the Ukrainian Hilfspolizei were primarily organizing events like Babi Yar, the genocide of Jews in Lvov, and other individual events. Of course, as Gideon Greif has pointed out, after 41, the Germans turned their attention to more mechanized forms of mass murder, and in the Western Ukraine and throughout the Ukraine, they brought in mobile gas units. Again, this was the work of the Ukrainian Hilfspolizei to help round up Jews for these mobile gas units to be murdered, as they had also participated in the roundup at Babi Yar and in Lvov. During the war, the organization, now we should think of the OUN, or the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, as the fascist party, and the UPA as their main military wing. During the war, the OUN actually split into two groups, very similar to the situation that had occurred during the Russian Civil War, when you had Petlura versus Skoropadsky. The one wing was led by Melnik, the other by Bandera. Bandera was more similar to Petlura in that he was determined to carry out or to create an independent Ukrainian state, whereas Melnik was willing to allow German occupation and German rule in the Ukraine. And so that division between the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists more or less persisted into the post-World War period. And in 1943, a final organization, when the Germans saw that they were losing the war, they created a Ukrainian SS division, Galicia, as well, mostly out of former members of the Nachtigall and Roland battalions. If we take all parts of the Ukraine and put them together, the population of Jews in the Ukraine in 1941 was 3 million. By 1944, that population had been reduced by half. So over 1.5, Gideon, I think, alluded to 1.6 million Jews murdered in the Ukraine by the combined efforts of Nazi Germany and Ukrainian fascists. As I said, the Ukrainian, the UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, continued to fight long after the Wehrmacht and the Germans retreated out of the Soviet Union. According to Soviet sources, they claimed that they killed 190,000 members of the Ukrainian insurgent army, which obviously tells you that this army was much larger than 200,000, because many of them survived and emigrated to the West either immediately after 1945 or in the years following 1950. Now, how is it that so many Ukrainian fascists, like so many Croatian fascists, managed to survive the war? And this is related to the presentation by Aleksandar Stojanovic about the survival of the Ustasha after World War II. First of all, we have to point out that the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union had agreed in 1943 to something called the Moscow Agreements. The Moscow Agreements had stipulated, first of all, that all Nazi war criminals and Nazi collaborator criminals, which would include the Croatian fascists and the Ukrainian fascists, would be extradited to the country in which they committed their crimes, and that they would be punished in those countries. Secondly, there was also an agreement among the three powers, and this was also brought up at Yalta, that Germany would not only be divided, but it would be pacified, and it would never be allowed to rise up as a military power. So, as we know, both of these, essentially the Moscow Agreements, were violated almost immediately at the end of the war, especially after the death of Roosevelt and the emergence of Harry Truman as the new president. Much of the personnel in the U.S. government changed immediately in 1945. Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasurer, Henry Morgenthau Jr., along with his deputy, Harry Dexter White, had authored something known as the Morgenthau Plan, which was a part of this overall Moscow Agreement, and which was agreed to at Yalta as well. This would have prevented Germany from ever rising against or ever being reunited again as an imperialist power. After Roosevelt died and Truman was reorganized the government, a different group of people took over foreign policy for the United States. The Dulles brothers, George Kennan, Robert Joyce, Harry Wisner, these people came in, and the OSS was shut down, and what became the future Central Intelligence Agency was being organized in 1945-46, with Harry Wisner as one of the leaders of the covert operations. Also, they brought from Germany General Reinhard Gehlen, who was the head of Wehrmacht intelligence, of the German Wehrmacht military intelligence, and he actually played a major role while he was in Washington, D.C. secretly from September 1945 until the summer of 1946 in helping reorganize the U.S. policy toward Nazi war criminals. So the policy toward Nazi war criminals in the United States and Britain, and that included, of course, the Nazi war criminals who were being collected in the displaced person camps in Europe at this time under British and American control. The new policy was to recruit them as assets, as future players and supporters of U.S. and British foreign policy, particularly U.S. foreign policy in Eastern Europe. And the ties with the Ukrainian fascists were were solidified in the fall of 1945. So by the time Truman had gone to Potsdam in July of 1945, the policy had already been flipped 180 degrees. And Henry Morgenthau resigned in July of 45, and because he knew that Truman was reversing by 180 degrees the policies of the U.S. government toward Nazi war criminals. And also Harry Dexter White would soon find himself brought up on charges by the House of Un-American Activities Committee and soon mysteriously die 2 days after testifying. So, and now all of this, so what we're seeing here is the perpetuation of Ukrainian fascism by the United States government and the British government from 1945 on. This was a deliberate policy to use these fascists and to perpetuate the fascist movement. And of course, also, Bandera was still alive. Bandera was running operations through Munich with the help of Galen and with the help of the CIA. And so the Ukrainian insurgent army continued to operate all the way until 1952, when most of its leaders had been captured and killed, thanks to the fact that there were communist agents in British intelligence like Kim Philby to pass on information to the Soviets. All of this is very well documented. John Loftus started writing about this in the early 80s, for example, in his book, The Belarus Secret. Chris Simpson wrote about it in Blowback and in The Splendid Blonde Beast in the late 80s. And the CIA itself confessed to all of this in one of its documents, which I have here, which you can obtain on the internet. Cold War Allies: The Origins of CIA's Relationship with Ukrainian Nationalists by Kevin Ruffner. This document, which was published in 1998, basically admits to the fact that the United States not only was assisting Ukrainian fascism from 1945 to 1952 directly, and including the Ukrainian insurgent army. And of course, it also mentions other fascists. I mean, there are other reports on Albanian, Croatian, and other fascists in Eastern Europe, but the activities included military operations, covert operations. But of course, it also included the capture and recruitment of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian fascists and their families as future assets for the overthrow of communism, but also for the restoration of these political movements in Eastern Europe one day. So there are a couple of more points I want to make before I close, and I'll make them briefly. And I've only scratched the surface, really, of what happened. One is the whitewashing of the Holocaust in the Ukraine, the rewriting of history that's going on. It's becoming widespread, not just in the Ukraine, it's happening across the United States, North America, NATO countries. We're seeing something similar to what the whitewashing of the Holocaust in Yugoslavia, the crimes of the Ustasha, which were whitewashed in the 1990s. We're seeing that happen again today with Ukrainian fascism. It's being apologized for and minimized and trivialized. But the real turning point was 2004. In 2004, you had something called the Orange Revolution, in which Viktor Yanukovych won the election, the presidential election in the Ukraine, but was overthrown by a coup in 2004. I'm not talking about 2014. 2004, Yanukovych was overthrown in a coup, and Viktor Yushchenko was brought to power. When Viktor Yushchenko came to power, he began a very deliberate and extensive policy of rehabilitating Ukrainian Nazis. This is something that is overlooked today. Yushchenko was the leader, really, of the rehabilitation of Ukrainian Nazism since starting in 2005 when he came into the presidential office. He even went to Yad Vashem he famous or infamously went to Yad Vashem and asked for the files on Ukrainian Nazis, and Yad Vashem told him that they didn't have any files. So he returned to Ukraine and he said, aha, see, we're not Nazis. The Ukrainian Insurgent Army, the Ukrainian Organization of Nationalists, all of these operations, maybe they fought with the Nazis, but we were good guys. Yad Vashem has cleared us. And so that thus began the turning of wartime monuments to the victims of Nazism into monuments and museums glorifying the Ukrainian Nazis. Yanukovych won the election again in 2010. And as we know, more recently, 2013, 2014, he was overthrown in a second coup d'etat, organized again by the United States. These were called the Maidan protests. And then we saw not only the glorification of the former Ukrainian Nazis and fascists, but in fact, the rise of actual Ukrainian fascist organizations. Many different organizations, only the most famous or infamous being the Azov Battalion, but all of these organizations glorifying Petlura and Bandera and all of the other Ukrainian Nazis from World War II and wearing the same insignias. Now, of course, we should distinguish between the blue and yellow flag and the red and black flag with the trident on it, which is the red and black flag is the actual Ukrainian Nazi flag. So you have groups like Right Sector, Svoboda, C13. The list is very extensive of these various organizations, and then they perpetrated serious crimes against against people in Odessa, in the trade union hall burning, and then against the people in the Donbass, where 14,000 people died in fighting between 2014 and 2022. That fighting actually was carried out primarily by Azov and other fascist paramilitary organizations, not by the Ukrainian army, which refused actually to participate in that. Another final point before I conclude. What is the purpose of the U.S. manipulation of the Ukraine? Well, of course, it has to do with NATO expansion, including Ukraine as part of NATO. Although one could say that de facto Ukraine had already was halfway in the door of the Ukraine after 2014. But we should also look at the financial arrangement between the United States, the European Union, and the Ukraine. The IMF had enforced certain structural adjustments on the Ukrainian economy. These were things that Yanukovych opposed, and which led directly to his overthrow, because the IMF had demanded that he stop providing subsidies for natural gas, oil, pensions, and salaries, and instead reduce them or take them back entirely. And this loan, this IMF loan, was held up at the very end. Of course, that was connected to application for membership in the European Union. That loan was withheld, and at that time, Russia offered, or Putin offered, Yanukovych a basically no strings attached loan of $15 billion in 2013. And of course, when he took that deal, that's when the CIA organized the Maidan coup, in which the Azov Battalion played the leading role in terms of conducting violence in the streets of Kiev. Is the Ukrainian government today supporting a revival of Nazism? Yes, it is. This does not, in and by itself, justify a war, in my opinion, but the people are whitewashing fascism, rehabilitating fascism. The government is, Zelensky is. Zelensky himself has worn some of these Nazi insignias and has completely trivialized the Holocaust by saying that what's going on in Ukraine today is far worse than the Holocaust. This is nonsense. What we must do is consider how we can proceed to fight this and to fight the whitewashing of the glorification of Nazism and genocide, both in Yugoslavia and in the Ukraine. And with that, I will thank you for your attention and conclude my report and open the floor to discussion. Anyone? I see again, Mr. Conforti, you are the fastest draw in that we have here.
Yes,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. I accidentally was trying to unmute you. Here, I'm sorry. Unmute yourself again. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I will be quick because I know that I took a lot of floor. So it was something that I haven't know that I heard from your presentation, which I think it was excellent. And I heard that when Yanukovych, it's 2004, when Yanukovych was, sorry, when I was overthrown by Yushchenko, let me pronounce the Ukrainian way, Yushchenko, and that Yushchenko went to Yad Vashem, and Yad Vashem said, we don't have anything on Ukrainian fascist. I mean, I don't understand. I don't know if you know.
Well, it didn't go quite that. I mean, it wasn't quite that extreme, but there were particular files that he was looking for that Yad Vashem could not provide. And he used that as a pretext to say that Yad Vashem had essentially, you know, whitewashed or cleared.
Yeah, I understand that. But
that was in 2005.
2005. Okay, but that was so he managed to get on power 2004. So that was in 2005. Yad Vashem. Now also what I think somehow it makes me wonder how it happened, right? I mean, I'm this is maybe some Israeli expert could tell us more. Unfortunately, Dr. Greif is not around. But also there was something also that I noticed that made my stomach churn. That Zelensky also claims, I don't know if it's true or not, that he is of Jewish origin, because his name probably is Zelensky means green, right? Somebody who is green, like Yiddish family name Green, and then he can say, how can we be fascist? I mean, I'm Jewish, I'm Jewish origin. And then he actually appeared in front of Knesset on a video beam, because he appears everywhere on video beams. I mean, he comments everything. He's like on drugs, but that doesn't matter. I mean, I don't know how they accept him to talk about anything to the Knesset, because it's he officially, whether or not he's Jewish, he is officially a commander of Azov, of right sector, of Aidar, of all those fascist paramilitary organizations that have been recently, I think maybe 2 years ago, they have been incorporated in official Ukrainian armed force.
That's right.
So he is, as a president, a commander of them. How can Knesset listen and allow Zelensky to appear in front of Knesset and address the Knesset and ask them for some idiotic, demands, like give us the gold, the iron dome, give us this, give us that. Of course, he didn't get anything, but I mean, to me, it's something that shouldn't have been allowed by Israeli. That's it. So I don't know if you have any comments on that, but I'm done.
I agree with you. The thing is, though, that Israel is being pressured into doing this, and also so are a lot of Jewish organizations, and that's why Jasenovac's Research Institute came into existence in the first place, because the Jewish organizations and the Holocaust organizations in the 1990s did nothing to talk about the Holocaust in Yugoslavia. They were complicit with the State Department in the suppression of the truth about the Ustasha, about the Holocaust in Yugoslavia, even about Germany's role in Yugoslavia. As I've mentioned many times before, when you went to the U.S., well, first of all, the U.S. Holocaust Museum, when it was opened in 1993, Franjo Tuđman was one of the special honored guests at the opening of the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And not only that, but if they had a big map of Europe where the Holocaust took place, and all of the concentration camps were on that map. I saw this with my own eyes at the U.S. Holocaust Museum. And if you looked at the country of Yugoslavia, it was simply white. There was nothing there, as though no Holocaust took place, no Jews were killed, nothing happened in Yugoslavia. It was like, it was like some country in Central Africa. It was just not mentioned. Michael Berenbaum, who is a friend of ours and someone I consider a personal friend and a person of integrity, was the actual president or head of the U.S. Holocaust Museum at that time. But he came out almost immediately. He told us in 1997 at the first international conference and exhibition on Jasenovac's, which led to the creation of Jasenovac's Research Institute. He said openly that he had no control over who was invited or what even the political content or the content of the exhibition was, because the State Department was running the museum, not him. He was more or less a figurehead, and the State Department and the foreign policy of the United States government was running the Holocaust Museum. So that is why Jasenovac's Research Institute was created in the first place, because there was the existing Holocaust organizations and Jewish organizations were morally bankrupt and refused to talk or even acknowledge that the Holocaust had taken place in Yugoslavia. So once again, we're faced with a similar dilemma today, where the crimes of the Ukrainian Nazis are being whitewashed, they're being minimized, trivialized, and we have to ask ourselves, how do we deal with that today? This is the problem we're facing today. We're facing the old problem of the trivialization of Croatian fascism and the Holocaust in Yugoslavia, and we're now confronted with yet another example, and it's getting worse, because just recently, as many of you know, the Italian ambassador to Croatia went to Jasenovac, laid a wreath at Jasenovac, and praised the Croats, said we stand united with the Croatian people, but he didn't say anything about being in solidarity with the victims of Jasenovac. In other words, he was another example, as Italian, in this case, high official, whitewashing the crimes of Jasenovac, the crimes of the Croatian fascists. So we see this happening, and we have to think about this. We have to give this very serious consideration. What do we do about this? How do we respond to this, this suppression of the truth about the Holocaust and genocide? I won't say anything more, but I think the next person on the speakers list is, oh, by the way, Aleksandar, do you want to say something about this? Because you're one of our guests, Dr. Stojanovic.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for your really good presentation. It was quite informative, a lot of new things even for me, and I'm actually following that topic from here a lot. There is a genuine problem with perception of Holocaust, genocide, and war crimes of the Second World War. The whitewashing started even before the war was officially over, the Second World War. In the climate of Cold War, you know about the Operation Paperclip and the Red Channel or Red Lines and everything. We are talking about huge number of people who were directly involved in the worst possible war crimes and atrocities, and they were never punished for anything. Just recently, I did a research and wrote an article on Strahinja Janjic. He was a Serbian collaborator. He headed an essentially Hilfe Polizei unit called the Serbian Gestapo. Somehow, he managed eventually to show himself as the victim of Nazism. Although he was a Nazi collaborator, he wore the Gestapo uniform, he had the special ID of Gestapo, did notorious actions against civilians and the members of resistance movements in Serbia during the occupation. And yet, although retired as a colonel of Wehrmacht, he managed to have a quite nice life in Hamilton, Canada, where he owned a home for care of elderly person and lived until I think age of 80. And his family still owns the same business. I bet his grandchildren have no clue who their grandfather actually was, and he's just the most recent case study I stumbled upon, or I managed to discover. It's crazy how we as a general humankind are not respecting people, not respecting victims, how the politicians and great power are always ready to use the victims and the pain of the people who lost someone to manipulate, to create political agenda, to win some political affection or gain some other things for themselves. And unfortunately, that sort of attitude toward the atrocities is something which lasts for 70 or 80 years already, and I don't see that changing. Jasenovac is maybe one of the best examples, because we have decades of constant discussions. What is the relatively exact number of the people killed in Jasenovac? And that's not the point. We can't establish never the exact number, but we can always emphasize how horrible was the destiny of the people who died there, how their everyday life looked while they were there. And also, that's a question for Croatian authorities. We have in the international law and the law of Croatia being the EU member, the crime of murder and a war crime is something which is always a possibility to open a new investigation. It never gets old. It can't be expired in a legal sense. Everything actually that is necessary is that a Croatian state attorney says, based on the information published on Jasenovac Research Institute or Gideon Greif's book or Viktor Novak's book or any other reliable historical source, we have a reasonable doubt that XY number of people are killed in the Jasenovac concentration camp and are buried on the territory which was covered, which made the concentration. Then they do the excavations and count the bodies, but no one is willing to do that for 8 years already, and I clearly doubt that we are ever going to live to see that. So unfortunately, that's my opinion. I combat such situation, these historical revisions, by education. It's also, in my humble experience, it's also the best way to spread the truth about the Holocaust. it is the best way, it is the best, I would say, weapon in the prevention of anti-Semitism. I'm highly involved in anti-Semitic trainings of youth in Serbia. So education is all we can do, having the good scholarly work that is reliable, that can be, cross-checked, and, that meets the certain academic standards, and then disseminate that kind of knowledge and that kind of historical truth to as wide possible public we can, especially focusing on the younger generation, because in this era of instant information, fake news, and attention that lasts like 3 seconds, if we don't get to them first, some fake news is, and then we are in bigger trouble than we already are.
Those were excellent summary, Aleksandar, really superb comments. The only thing I would add to it is that aside from education, we have commemoration. And that is absolutely essential, as is education. And that's, fortunately, we have something called the Holocaust Park in Brooklyn, of which I'm co-president of as well. And so we have a monument to the victims of Jasenovac. We have a monument to the victims of Jadovno. And so we have at least a base there. And of course, victims to all of the major camps. And in fact, we're going to unveil a new monument in June to the victims of the siege of Leningrad. That was just approved last week by the city of New York. So that's going to happen in June. June 12th is the date we're focusing on for that. Norman, you've been waiting patiently. We only have about 13 minutes to go. So I would ask everybody to make their comments short at this time so that we can get everyone in. We can go a little over 13 minutes, but Norman, go ahead. You're still muted. Sorry, Norman.
Okay, I'll be very quick. This was Barry. Your presentation is about 7 weeks of one of my courses. It was really great, Barry. It was really an enormous achievement. It really was, and
thank you.
Not as good a thing as I've heard, but there are maybe a couple of other quick points.
Sure.
Aleksandar, I agree entirely with Aleksandar. We have got to educate and hopefully not only educate in terms of academia, but take accurate, good material and popularize it and bring it to a much larger audience. Gore Vidal said famously, we live in the United States of amnesia. And there's an element of truth in that. And unfortunately, that has become that becomes increasingly global. And our role is to fight against that. Your presentation was really outstanding across the board, yes, and carrying forward those ideas and those facts we've got to do. One last quick point, very quick. What we're dealing with, and I've been involved a little bit in this in terms of my teaching and some of the things I've been sending around, this is global. I mean, it's not only the crimes of Nazi fascism, it's the monstrous crimes of Japanese imperialism in China, in Korea, in Asia, and the way in which those crimes were covered up. And this week, Ukraine apologized to Japan for, in one of their videos, comparing Hirohito to Hitler and Mussolini. And I use this as an example, and I used it also to bring forward materials about what, with Hirohito's direct support, the Japanese did in Manchuria, China, Korea, particularly chemical warfare, bacteriological warfare, experiments on human beings similar to Mengele's, similar. And the rich history of that and the way in which the people who did this got off scot-free, not only Hirohito and the royal family, but there are people that we can reach globally and bring up what we're doing. And I'll try to continue to do that. In fact, I may even send to some Chinese sources that I have.
Absolutely. We'll make this video available to everyone. Yes.
Yeah.
Anyone?
Thank you.
Now we have a lot of people haven't spoken. Does anyone want to make any? Oh, Linda, you have your hand up. Is that correct?
Yes.
Go ahead, Linda, please.
I was wondering if you could comment on how involved President Zelensky is with the fascist forces, and how much is the party that's currently in power? How much are they connected with all of these fascist people?
Well, we know that Zelensky has banned all other political parties and organizations, but he's allowed the fascist groups to persist. So he hasn't banned fascists, but he's banned anti-fascist organizations. Zelensky is of Jewish origin, but he doesn't. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Linda.
Yeah, I've had people say, "Oh, well, you're crazy. He can't be fascist. He's Jewish." And I said, "Well,
I call him the Jewish lawyer for the fascists, is what I call him. He's, you know, he has been the perfect figurehead for this rehabilitation and glorification of Nazism, and it's sad to see the consequences of that. Actually, since the Orange Revolution in 2004, there have been voices of reason that have said, look, if you go down this road, you're going to destroy Ukraine. You're going to lead to the destruction of Ukraine. This is precisely what has happened. Now, Hitler led to the destruction of Germany. So we shouldn't be surprised if fascists who, even though they were only represented a small minority of the overall population, nevertheless were able, through their support of US foreign policy and EU foreign policy and NATO foreign policy, were able to become a far larger force in Ukrainian politics than they deserved to be, and were in fact enabled by people like Zelensky and Poroshenko before him, and Yushchenko before him. So this has been set up for a long time, and ultimately the losers are going to be the Ukrainian people above all, sadly.
How important do you think the influence of the United States? I mean, we've got
central to the whole thing.
Percentage-wise, how much did they empower these fascists?
100%. 100%. There's no question about it. The foreign policy of the United States was to enable to use them as in order to force out any political leadership that would be unfavorable to IMF, World Bank control, NATO expansion, joining EU, or anyone who might want to be have a friendly policy, never mind a pro-Russian policy, but a friendly policy toward Russia. This was 100% thought up in the United States. Absolutely. The Orange Revolution didn't happen by itself.
Why couldn't they just, what's the argument against Ukraine just being neutral, staying out? I mean, why hasn't that been allowed to, be okay?
Yeah, somebody else could, Professor Gronowitz, would you like to comment on that? Oh, you have to unmute yourself. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Now unmute yourself. You still haven't unmuted. Sorry. I'm trying to ask you to unmute.
Yeah. Okay.
There you go.
Ever since Stalingrad, the policy of the U.S., which is based on full spectrum dominance, which the Pentagon announced back before 9/11 in June of 2000, dominance. The U.S. is interested in global control. You can go back to 2000. You can go back to 1813, and Jefferson receives a letter from Adams, and Adams says the aim of our policy should be global control. So it's been uninterrupted. And because the Red Army beat the Wehrmacht, that's the reason why Truman was put in and not Wallace as the 44 candidate. Because Truman famously said on the floor of the Senate, if the Germans are winning, we support the Russians. If the Russians are winning, we support the Germans. And they've been supporting Nazism and neo-Nazism ever since, and divide and conquer. And of course, Russia's a huge landmass, and they want to chop it up. But it's not going to work because of the Russian Revolution and the fact that Russia and China both freed themselves from control of the Anglo-American banking establishment. And they never regained it, and it's all over, but the world is going to suffer. And the world is suffering and will continue to suffer because of this. And Ukraine will be dismembered come hell or high water because of the beauty of your talk, if I can call it the awful beauty of your talk, is that you demonstrated absolutely how important this fascist nationalist tendencies in Ukraine come together at certain key points in 20th century history. And were utilized by this. The great powers, but they have nothing to offer the great powers to the people anymore. So this is going to continue and continue and continue. Your one question I have is your citation for the CIA Cold War report from 1998. Cold War Allies, and who's that by?
The author for the CIA was Kevin C. Ruffner.
Kevin C. Ruffner. That's very important. R-U-F-F-N-E-R.
Correct. Yeah, and he is very candidly explains that the U.S. was decidedly trying to use the Nazis and to co-opt them. But of course, my presentation is based more on other sources as well. But this source is an admission by the CIA themselves in exposing in 1998 that they were in fact using Ukrainian fascists for the overthrow of the Soviet Union, but in general for U.S. Projecting U.S. power into Eastern Europe.
They rehabilitated. I mean, it was Conant, the Harvard president for years, who was put in charge of rehabilitating 98% of the prominent Nazis in Germany, except a few figureheads that they executed, but the bulk of them were rehabilitated, brought in and integrated into US and Canadian societies, and the Ukrainians, of course, because their entire, tragically, the national identity, as you demonstrated, was starting with Petlura and Bandera and their associates. That's how they're identifying. Mm-hmm. It's tragic, but
we're coming to the end of our event. Any last thoughts? Aleksandar, do you want to, I don't see any other hands being raised. So Aleksandar, would you like to perhaps close out the meeting today with any final comments?
No, I'm good. I already
Okay, I mean, your final comments before were excellent. Yeah. I'm sure we all appreciated them. Well, then it is 4 o'clock, and that was the closing time for our event. So I want to thank you all for participating and attending our 20th annual Jasenovac Research Institute conference. And again, we will continue to keep you updated. We will spread the video. We'll send it to everyone. And we we'll hopefully see each other again soon, either at, thank you for Happy May Day. We did talk about that earlier. We will send it to you, and we will hopefully meet each other again at commemorations and future conferences. And I thank you again from the bottom of my heart for your kind attention and participation. And we must continue to work together to fight not only fascism, but the forgetting about the crimes of genocide in Yugoslavia and elsewhere during the Holocaust. Thank you very much, and we'll see each other again soon.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.